Michigan State Institute of Public Policy and Social Research, is starting these opportunities and decided to start on this topic. As was shared with the Office of Global Michigan and the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. And just to give a little background on the work that our office does broadly, Global Michigan is focused on immigrant integration, creating opportunities and empowerment for immigrants across the state. We work across state governments around equity, equal access to services, and just work with state agencies throughout state governments to that end. Specifically, the Refugee Services Program within Global Michigan focuses on the refugee populations and those with humanitarian status. So we also serve and work on programs funded to provide services to asylees, victims of trafficking, Cuban and Haitian entrants, which we've seen quite an increase in, which I will kind of get into some of those specifics. Also, as mentioned, I'm State Refugee Coordinator for the state of Michigan, which is a federally mandated position for any state that is providing refugee services. And so essentially what I and my team are responsible for is the coordination of all public and private resources as it relates to refugee resettlement in the state. We provide technical assistance to our partners, those in local municipalities, private agencies that are all represented here today. We're responsible for the administration of funding, program development, analysis of the outcomes and programs that we provide and fund, and then also, have a strong sort of partnership and collaborative network building role, again, across state government, across local government, and within communities. So just to kind of give you guys a general overview, I'll leave to Susan to kind of speak a little bit more about resettlement agency role and some of the work. But just generally refugee resettlement, the process. The resettlement agencies, there are 6 in Michigan, 9 national resettlement agencies that have affiliates across the country. And generally, reception and placement is done for approximately 90 days. It's funded for 90 days. There are some additional programs that go on for 6 to 8 months. But reception and placement, that initial welcome of refugees into communities is done for 90 days. Our office works closely with community partners, with those resettlement agencies to develop community capacity and have conversations around what capacity development needs to take place, what a community's capacity looks like to ensure that the community is ready to receive the kinds of numbers that we then propose to the federal government and is ultimately approved by the U.S. Department of State. So then from there, our office also, after that 90-day period, funds essentially post-resettlement services, integration work, employment work, work with local school districts, health services and local health departments, as well as other healthcare providers. And then we just continue to do work, as I said, with state agency partners around, as I said, equal access to services, as well as, trying to increase services to refugees through some what traditionally would be considered mainstream benefits for the communities across our state. I think I want to touch a little bit on, 2 of the sort of high profile things that have gone on this work lately, both in Afghanistan and the Operation Allies Welcome, as well as obviously, I'm sure a lot of you are paying attention and interested in the events in Ukraine. So the Afghanistan and the Operation Allies Welcome was an extremely unique sort of situation and operation. It ended up being served and that need met through the refugee resettlement process, but it was not done under traditional refugee resettlement means. Individuals were brought to the U.S. as a part of the evacuation, housed temporarily on military bases, and then refugee resettlement agencies were asked to do really next to the impossible. We saw approximately just over 1,000 refugees under the previous administration in the last 2 fiscal years combined And Michigan welcomed a little over 1,800 Afghan individuals in a span of 5 months. So what was sort of asked of states, asked of resettlement agencies, was really unprecedented. What we, in recognizing that really early on, what we did was set up a state emergency response system. We actually worked really closely with the Michigan State Police to kind of model it after, the emergency response type of system. And we set up temporary housing solutions while we found the permanent homes for refugees within communities, set up, on-site health services at those temporary housing options. And then, I'm happy to say, 6-7 months into this work, about 90-95% of those individuals are in permanent housing, have a really hugely successful employment rate for them. But as I mentioned, the sort of manner that it transpired under when they first started coming to the US, we weren't even sure that they were going to be eligible for the funds that the federal government supplies for the traditional refugee resettlement programming. So it was just a lot of constant sort of reactive programming to make sure that we met the needs as things sort of unfolded. Similarly now with the Ukrainian situation, the federal government is looking at a sort of unique and different approach to welcoming Ukrainians. You probably heard in the news that the Biden administration announced plans to welcome 100,000 Ukrainians to the US. That is going to come through many different sort of pathways, family reunification. Some will come through the traditional refugee resettlement process if they have family, reason, and interest in a permanent solution, where they will stay in the US indefinitely if that is their choice, and go through that refugee resettlement process. However, the federal government has also set up Uniting for Ukraine, which will be operated through Homeland Security, and really will be a sponsorship model program where individuals within the US will have to complete an affidavit of support and have opportunity to sponsor a Ukrainian family coming to the US. There is, as a part of President Biden's bill package that he put forward to Congress, there is a request to provide support through the Office of Refugee Resettlement to this population. And so I highlight this because it's, once again, there's a definite shift sort of in a reacting to and providing a mechanism to bring people to safety based on individual circumstances. And I think, that obviously is needed as far as being responsive to the need. But I bring it up because I think it has brought up some concerns around the traditional refugee resettlement pipeline and, the potential that other populations like Congolese, people from Somalia, from Sudan, that we traditionally have served in Michigan, are seeing longer waits to be able to go through that refugee resettlement process. Similarly, Cubans and Haitians are experiencing extreme need to seek safety and opportunity, and we don't have a lot of the same supports and benefits in place for those populations. And so we're really hoping that this shift also means that we can explore those opportunities and creative partnerships with the federal government around ways to make sure we're serving everyone that potentially could be in need. So along those lines, as far as sort of the future of refugee resettlement in the US and in Michigan, just looking at how growth can be achieved and how we can change from a reactive process to a much more proactive process in building systems that are flexible and resilient to changes, whether it's changes in administrations or it's changes within policies and needs across the globe. And so in Michigan, we are looking to be proactive. We've experienced a real sort of initially a setback to the infrastructure of refugee resettlement under the previous presidential administration, and then a bit of a setback, in the midst of trying to rebuild staffing and community partnerships and resources, had this absolute need to be responsive to the influx of Afghans to our communities because of the need that was presented there. But as we move forward, we are trying now to plan to, as I said, build that resilience and flexibility within the system and look at how refugee resettlement can be done in a way that, embraces other community partners and brings in, other state agencies and state funding opportunities to make sure that, we can broaden that network and broaden that net of sort of safety and security. All right, I'm going to let you introduce Susan.
Thanks so much. We're also privileged to get some on the ground perspective today. And next is going to be Susan Kratt, who is Branch Director for Refugee and Immigrant Services with Bethany Christian Services out of Grand Rapids, where she's worked in refugee services for more than 10 years and served as Executive Director of the Refugee Education Center. Thanks, Susan.
There we go.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here in Lansing with you all today. As they said, I'm the Executive Branch Director of Refugee and Immigrant Services at Bethany in Grand Rapids. I've been there for 2 years, and it's been a very strange 2 years, especially since I started right after the pandemic hit. And so this is one of the first events I've had the opportunity to be in person with people. So yeah, I'm sorry if I'm a little socially awkward after all. So at Bethany, we operate a variety of refugee and immigrant services in Grand Rapids that I oversee. I'll talk mostly about refugee resettlement, but I'll say that we serve a lot of the groups that Ben mentioned. We have a trafficking victims assistance program that's for foreign-born trafficking victims. We work with Cuban Haitian entrants. We have worked with some Ukrainians that have come through what's called the Lautenberg program. I won't go into too many details about that at this point. And then we have an unaccompanied refugee minor program where we work with minors coming through the resettlement agencies, but are without an accompanied adult. We put them in foster care either in group settings or with foster homes. And we have the longest running unaccompanied refugee minor program in the country. We also work with unaccompanied children. That includes children coming from the US border with Mexico. But we've also been serving unaccompanied Afghan minors through that program since the evacuation of Afghanistan this past year. We do have a refugee resettlement program. That's the resettlement and placement program that Ben mentioned. We're contracted with one of 9 national voluntary agencies that work with the federal government, with the State Department, to help connect overseas into communities in the US, such as Grand Rapids. We're one of 2 resettlement agencies in Grand Rapids. We're contracted with the voluntary agency Church World Service to provide resettlement and placement programming. We have another partner there, that's Samaritas. They work with Immigration and Refugee Services. So we've been doing this for some time now. We have a very diverse refugee population in Grand Rapids. We've resettled, it started when we resettled refugees through the President Ford's program to evacuate refugees coming out of Vietnam. So we served in the 1970s to place Vietnamese refugees in the Grand Rapids community. Since then, we've seen refugees coming from all over the world, including Sudan and Somalia, Burma, Bhutan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, just to name a few. Most recently, we've seen folks coming out of the Democratic Republic of Congo. So the Congolese refugees have been the largest population we've been resettling in Grand Rapids over the past several years. And then more recently, we did participate in the Afghan Placement Assistance Program that Ben mentioned that ran somewhat parallel to our regular resettlement and placement program. There we go. So that program, we through that program, we have received around 250 Afghan evacuees, and then we are also serving about 21 unaccompanied Afghan minors through that program. And I'll go in a little bit detail of the difficulties that is placed on our systems in a second. But I also want to say the Cuban patient entrant program has been another big program for us recently. We've had about 100 arrivals a month walking in to receive services at Bethany that were not necessarily notified of before they come. So it's been a pretty big uptick for us. We also operate some longer term programs, and then we're contracted through both the Office of Refugee Resettlement at the federal level and through the State Refugee Coordinator's Office here in Michigan to provide some of those post-resettlement services. So we do casework, helping with employment and navigating job laddering or getting re-credentialed, things like that. But with the arrival of Afghan evacuees, a lot of our systems have been strained quite a bit. In the previous administration, at the federal level, the refugee resettlement numbers went down quite a bit. This caused a lot of our systems to downsize as well. The new administration has been committed to refugee resettlement. We didn't see a ton of folks coming in right away because they were building up systems overseas, as well as the difficulties we have with COVID and travel being safe and all of that. But with the Afghan evacuation, it kind of became all hands on deck and we'll make it work, which basically meant it was on our team to make it work. So we saw a lot of staff on the ground have to handle really hard things. If you're familiar with some of the stressors that happened around the unaccompanied Afghan minors who were in influx shelters waiting to be placed in more appropriate settings, we're still working with a lot of those youth to reunify them with their families who are overseas, either in Afghanistan or Qatar. We've been advocating for a more clear, direct process. We've been able to work very closely with Ben's office, and that's been really helpful for us to be able to try to get more coordination so that children and families can be reunited. We think a lot of the behavioral problems that we've seen and we may have heard about are caused from some of that distress of not being with loved ones and hearing stories from loved ones in Afghanistan where they're really struggling. If you've heard some of the news, there's just still not a very safe place for a lot of the families that we're hoping to relocate. I was going to say something else and I forgot. Yeah, so we've been kind of trying to flip the switch, like Ben said, to becoming less reactive. At Bethany, we're trying to work more closely with our local partners. The situation with Afghanistan did kind of put to light some of the need to be more coordinated on the ground with social services that are just generally available in communities. We're working more closely with the cities that we resettle in. That includes Grand Rapids, Kentwood, Wyoming, and a couple others. We've been working more closely with school districts, with housing folks, with nonprofit agencies that saw this kind of come to the news and they're like, oh yes, we want to get involved. And so that we've always said, yes, and have you met our Congolese friends? And have you heard about our Cuban patient friends? And it's actually in our community, and I think at the state level, we're starting to see some change so that welcoming isn't just the responsibility or being done by resettlement agencies like Bethany, but it's really the whole community welcoming individuals in and saying, how do we become responsive? How do we support and listen and truly be inclusive? Which it will take time for sure, especially when you have such diversity. Even within just one community like the Congolese, there are hundreds of tribes within that population that don't necessarily interact very often. And so it does take time, but we're very grateful to be a part of this work and to get to see the impact that refugees and immigrants have on our community. The diversity, the vibrancy that it's brought to us has been such a wonderful gift.
Thank you so much. We're also privileged to have an on-the-ground perspective from Lansing. Erika Brown-Binion serves as Executive Director of the Refugee Development Center in Lansing and worked in education for the past 15 years as a literary specialist, elementary school teacher, and on the faculty at Lansing Community College. Erika, welcome.
Thank you. Forgot about LCC. The third child. Thanks for having me here today. I see lots of friendly faces out here and delighted to be with our colleagues. I think it's a good setup because Ben's office at the state level really has done a great job all over Michigan to set us up for success. And Susan at the Resettlement Agency level, sometimes we get confused for that. We are at the RDC, an independent nonprofit, so we don't do the resettlement work. And so we're really grateful to partners like Susan, and I see our friends from St. Vincent Refugee Services out here. Our work would not be possible without having a resettlement agency locally. So in Lansing, resettlement has been going on for over 4 decades. And the RDC, we're celebrating our 20th birthday tonight. If anyone wants to join us at our birthday celebration fundraiser. But the point is 20 years ago, leaders in Lansing recognized that the short period of resettlement support was not enough to really help people thrive. There are other services available now that Ben mentioned, and really that's a kudos to his office for thinking about post-resettlement work and beyond that initial 90-day period. But if you can imagine being dropped off in a brand new place, brand new culture, brand new language, brand new weather, and you have really 90 days of intensive case management support, it's not enough to be able to thrive. And so 20 years ago, the RDC was born really out of a commitment to creating that place of welcome, creating that place to figure out what people need. We don't pretend to know what is needed from the folks that arrive. Susan mentioned the very wide variety of folks that we welcome here. Similar to Grand Rapids, Lansing is very diverse. Democratic Republic of Congolese is our largest population right now, but Somalia and Sudan and Eritrea and Syria and Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan and Burma and Bhutan. That could be one classroom that I'm teaching. When I started 14 years ago, that probably was a makeup of my classroom. And so the diversity even among those populations, as Susan also mentioned, is unique. So our job is, one of the challenges, kind of honing in on what are the needs of each individual population and do constant needs assessment to figure out what can we do to help folks be able to thrive. So our services really are founded on that. The largest programs that we have are English language classes, one of the largest in our region. Our numbers have gone up quite a bit with the large influx of Afghans, as Ben mentioned. In the last 5 months, we've had 300 people arrive. But over the course of time, our classes are always full. So it speaks to the desire to learn and start over and really immerse oneself in the culture and language here. And so we see that in our English classes. We also have a mentoring program for older youth as they navigate through college and career and kind of navigating the American education system. We also work with families when they first arrive to navigate the American school system K through 12, because it's typically very, very different from what people have experienced. So we work one-on-one with families to kind of walk them through what to expect, and then bridge communication between school districts, teachers, parents, and the students. So creating those connections and helping folks navigate is one of our primary goals for the last 20 years, and that has evolved too. So besides just learning English or navigating the school system, we have kind of ventured into, okay, initial housing is taken care of by our friends at Resettlement, but what happens 2 or 3 years down the line when there's a housing crisis and people aren't sure what to do to navigate it? So that's kind of another place that we step in. That's a new position that we're adding this year, and will be focused 100% on helping people kind of with long-term home ownership. So our goal, again, is to be kind of a connector. We don't pretend to be an expert in housing, but we're working with our friends at Capital Area Housing Partnership and Financial Empowerment Center and Habitat for Humanity, and recognizing there are a lot of resources that exist already here in our community, and how do we make those connections. That's a big role of the RDC. This year has been really, really busy the last 5 months with our newest arrivals from Afghanistan. For the last 4 years, it's been really slow, but we have a large population of newcomers, as we refer to folks in our community that still access and require services. But with the newest arrivals, one of the biggest challenges has been, I think Susan mentioned it, and I think Ben too, but the immediacy of resettlement is something that we don't always recognize. So we're seeing on the news right now, Ukrainians who are fleeing and are in a bordering country and are being, labeled as a refugee right now. The reality is it's not a quick process to make it to a place like Lansing or to any place in the United States or to any place where they are resettled. Typically, the process is you wait and you want to go home. This war in Ukraine started 6-7 weeks ago now. And you can imagine 6-7 weeks ago, before life had changed, people want to return to that. So that's the story. That's a common thread through every refugee story. When people flee, they're in a bordering community and their hope is to go home. And that doesn't always happen. And they wait and they wait and they wait. And the typical time that a person spends living as a refugee is, some statistics have it upwards of 10 years. It is a very, very long time. The majority of folks that I've worked in these 14 years, most of the kids were born in a refugee camp, and they lived most of their early life in a refugee camp. And then they show up here and they are going to Eastern High School and they have to figure it out. And that's kind of, where the RDC comes in. But the time spent before arrival is what's very different from what we're seeing now with folks from Afghanistan. The evacuation happened, and just a couple of months later, they arrived in our community. So the needs, the support for mental wellness and just having access to services and being active, being involved in English classes or youth programs or our summer camp or whatever. We have a women's sewing circle, a boys soccer team, all of those kind of activities, basketball sometimes, but all of those activities are really, really important to long-term successful integration and, feeling safe and at home. And so that's where the RDC tries to come in. That's where our focus is all of the time. And one of the ways that we do that is by, we have a whole cadre of what we call cultural brokers. So these are folks who have been refugees themselves, made it through that process, found their way to Michigan, and are employed through us and really are the leaders for us to help guide kind of decision-making as we plan for programs and what's most needed for folks. So that's the RDC, and yeah, I'll answer questions in a little bit.
Thank you so much. We're now privileged to have Andy Johnston, who's the Senior Vice President of the Grand Rapids Chamber of Commerce, and where he manages advocacy efforts. And he is involved with the business case for refugees and immigrants and involved in state advocacy. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, man. It's great to be with leaders doing some amazing work. You can tell they're so passionate about what they do, and it's awesome because it's about people. Ultimately, that's what business is about too, and you're making a real difference in a lot of people's lives. So thank you for what you're doing day in, day out. So we have a refugee crisis that's been happening. If you haven't heard, we also have a bit of a talent crisis. And as somebody really smart once said, let's not let these things go to waste, right? And let's try to fix the systems that I think many of us in this room see as broken or need of improvement. And that's where part of this business case comes from on immigration and refugees. Just this week, I'm handling multiple questions from businesses. How do I get engaged? How do I help? Because of the talent crisis, but also seeing what's happening in the news. The Michigan website has been great, if you're not familiar with that, as a way to volunteer to get engaged. But the Grand Rapids Chamber's journey on supporting immigration reform has been going on for quite a while. It started when we got linked up with the New American Economy, and we brought together stakeholders in our community to do a report on the impact that New Americans have on Kent County. And the data was so impactful. And we were really pleased to partner with people like Bethany and Samaritas and the Right Place and the Hispanic Chamber on this effort. And the data was clear, and it was something that Governor Snyder really reinforced under his term, that immigrants, new Americans, they don't take jobs, they create jobs. They don't take tax dollars, they contribute to tax dollars. And when you can put that data out there, and couple that with the talent issues that employers are facing, I want to use this opportunity to, bring that Overton policy window together to actually make some movement on sensible immigration reform. Because if you've ever looked at the system, it's totally broken. Well, maybe not totally broken, but mostly broken. Lighthouse Immigration Advocates that does some great work in this area out in Holland. They have a map that shows you, almost like the board game way to get to yes to like legal status in the United States. And there's about 40 ways to get to no, and there's about 4 ways to get to yes. And those ways to get to yes can take months, years, decades to get there, and that's just not sensible, and especially given the impact that it's having on people. Wolverine Building Group, we were having an engagement call with them. They're a construction firm in Western Michigan doing business across the state, and they heard what we were doing around immigration reform and said, boy, do we have a story for you. We've been talking today about how, Afghanistan, Ukraine get a lot of attention. Venezuela, the number of people leaving Venezuela is gigantic. And they have an engineer who came to GVSU because his brother was here. He needed to learn English, went to GVSU. And while he's learning English, he's like, I might as well get an MBA too. And he was here under temporary protection status, got this great job. He is the model employee. Clients want to work with him. But because of the way the system is now with his temporary protection status, he cannot work. He essentially has to volunteer. He cannot get paid if he wants to ultimately get legal status. And the experts up here could probably explain to you why that is. I just look at it as a chamber lobbyist and says, that's dumb. Let's talk to more people about fixing that situation. So I really want everybody in this room to keep up the drumbeat of talking to every elected official that may have ability to weigh in on this about changing the system. So we did that report. We got the data with the New American Economy. And then right before the pandemic hit, we launched the Michigan Compact on immigration, where the Grand Rapids Chamber brought together a lot of the business groups in the state saying we need to find common sense solutions to that. We're still moving that forward. And then locally, I would encourage everybody to Google Kent County Welcome Plan, because like Susan was mentioning, welcoming really is a full community effort. And so we took the data we got with the study, built this welcome plan. We're now hiring a coordinator through Kent County. We hope to have that hired really soon. Some of the focus groups we did in putting together our welcome plan, though, for somebody who's not as close to this as everybody else up here, was just really eye-opening. And unfortunately, with the officer involved shooting, we had the tragic shooting with a Congolese immigrant recently. It just brought together one of the focus group meetings I had where a sheriff's deputy was meeting with a new American, and they were just talking about the differences that people experience with law enforcement in different countries and how the norms aren't the same and how those interactions can lead to tragic outcomes, and how we need to continue to communicate, the differences to create understanding. So we're really excited to get more of this welcome plan work up and going. Our CEO council that the Grand Rapids Chamber has stood up in recent years is taking this as their #1 issue, taking the welcome plan and then figuring out what the business community's role is going forward. But that's not why I was asked to join you today. The reason I was asked to join you today is because I am not Steve Tabachman with Global Michigan, but we are partnering with him to try to get advanced the Michigan Global Talent Attraction and Retention Initiative in the state budget. We think we can do some pretty good damage in a positive way with about $4.5–5 million a year to help keep the students, the students from other countries that are studying here, try to keep them in Michigan, keep that talent here. We're trying to help do better when it comes to navigating licensing and credentials for new Americans, and other resources that will help fund this welcome work on a state level and help other communities implement it as well. So I'm really excited for this conversation. I feel so lucky to get to work at an organization that's focused on creating a thriving and prosperous West Michigan for all, and Michigan, hopefully. And this is one of the ways we can do that. I've just seen the success we've had as a state on criminal justice reform. Joe Hobman's in the back. Sorry, former state representative Joe Hobman. We didn't plan this, but he was one of the leaders on criminal justice reform when he was in the legislature. And the data that we brought to that discussion, the way the left and the right came together, said this is the right thing to do, and they all got it. We got a lot of it done. I think we need to set ourselves up for that moment in America where we can finally get comprehensive immigration reform done. That's what I want to see happen, hopefully in my lifetime. And would love everybody supporting this room to get that done. And I look forward to the discussion, Matt.
Thanks so much. Everyone made good time. So we have time for questions. For those watching online, you'll have to submit your questions and we'll try to get them answered. But hopefully someone in the room wants to raise a question or topic for the panelists while we have them. And I believe, do we have a walking mic? We do. We have a walking mic. So please raise your hands. Everyone is shy from 2 years on Zoom. Okay.
How do you, each of you can comment on how you connect with employers when you talk about the talent pool? I'm kind of curious what you would advise employers who are looking for, in some cases, hundreds of people to add to the workforce, particularly when they discovered how great this population is as a workforce member.
Andy, that sounds like maybe you're.
Well, I mean, so there's a lot of ways we've tried to connect them, but I mean, I would defer to maybe Bethany and Samaritas, or Bethany.
I can start. You can.
Okay.
I mean, so our office within the state does have the Michigan International Talent Solutions program that does focus on connecting employers with individuals that need re-credentialing work, relicensing work, and those kinds of things. We also have a lot of employers reach out directly to our office, and we try and connect them either with the employment service providers that we have under contract. We also work really closely with our Michigan Works agencies to make those connections in some of our larger areas where refugees in particular resettle. We have Refugee and Immigrant Navigators that are positioned within the Michigan Works agencies to try and make those connections as well for those working with the workforce development boards in communities to make sure that connection is made. But we also have Bethany is one of our employment service providers, as well as St. Vincent here. And Lansing receives funding to do some of that initial employment work and has great partnerships. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, we have staff that specifically work with employers interested in employing refugees. And then we also work with companies that maybe want to take it a step deeper and look at what are opportunities for job lettering, on-site English language classes, just continued support. And yeah. So employment is not the issue. The bigger issue right now is the time that it's taking to get employment authorization. Because of some of the big populations that have arrived, we've just seen long delays. So folks even a year into being here not having workplace authorization.
Other questions?
I'd like to follow up on that. Why is it taking so long to get work authorization?
It's not represented here. So yeah, the best
So I think it depends on which population you're talking about. And that just speaks to Andy's point about how complicated it is. Depending on individual's immigration status, there's, you know, a different sort of path to pursue that, potentially, you know, additional barriers, I should say. So with the Afghan population, there's been a lot of challenges. They were evacuated so quickly. There's been a lot of challenges around some documentation and like getting that all sorted. And then so many needed that so quickly that just processing at the federal level is taking time. Additionally, with the Cuban population, there's been a large number that have been coming to the US. And so like just getting applications processed timely is the primary challenge, as well as, like I said, just them, you know, facing some of their own barriers around documentation. These people typically are fleeing with the clothes on their back, you know, and in some instances, they don't have time to prepare and plan, nor do they know what paperwork they need from their home country once they get here to pursue these things. So, you know, there's programs in place to help pursue those documents overseas through World Education Services and others that can help with some of those things, but it's obviously, you know, just so many challenges. But yeah, the key issue I would think is around the federal government.
And speaking of the federal government, so like the issue that I'm seeing with one of my employers and the gentleman from Venezuela is that, as we all know, COVID scrambled all the supply chains, and one of the supply chains that seems to have scrambled is our immigration process. The backup is substantial. I don't know exactly the cause, but it's often blamed on the pandemic, on the big delay we're seeing with federal government processing different applications.
Yeah, and that, just to Ben's point, the EAD or employment authorization documentation, the challenges have been primarily for those groups that don't come through the traditional resettlement and placement program. Those groups, because like Erika said, there's a long time overseas waiting, there's processes overseas that take place that can get them ready for workplace authorization day one. But with like Cuban Haitian, with the Afghan community, and potentially with the Ukrainian community, we're going to see a delay in being able to process that because their documents are just not as straightforward.
Coming, or you can be loud.
Can I say it? Hear me? This question would be for Andy.
Yeah.
You talked about the man from Venezuela who was not allowed to get any pay for his work. Is that specifically because of his temporary protection status?
Yes, and then where he's at in the process, that was one of the requirements that's put upon him. Because he ran out of time for his eligibility to work, essentially. And so now he can't work legally in the country. So he's depleting his savings while he's trying to wait for an answer from the federal government. And, you know, Congressman Meyer's office has some great constituent services folks that work on these issues a lot. Maybe because we have great people like Bethany in our community, they've worked a lot on these issues and they've gone as far as they can. So now they're just hoping he gets a positive answer soon. And he's lucky that he works for a large enough employer that is willing to hire an attorney for him to help him do this. Not every new American has that, you know, that luxury afforded to them by their employer. And that was what the CEO said. He's like, I think about people that work for smaller companies that don't have these resources. Where do they go? They have to rely on other, you know, nonprofits and other resources.
And back.
I'm interested in hearing more about, I think it was Susan, but really for anyone, talked about behavioral issues. And I want to learn more about what kind of structured pathway is there to offer behavioral health, mental health, assistance support, especially considering the heightened stress that these folks experience. And how marketed it is as well, Susan. And I believe I'm in that community and people don't know about it. And we're dealing with a lot of stigma, right, within our cultures that don't understand about these services, that maybe we're a little bit apprehensive or we are less educated or differently educated about it. And we come here and don't really cater to that.
Yes, so at Bethany, we're kind of lucky, I guess, that we have, I can't see you and I hate that. We're lucky because we have a counseling center on site. So we have a lot of experience offering a wide variety of clinical services. So we have a variety of therapists that work. Usually they're based on a specific program, but we're working on providing a larger array of options. Specifically, this recent group of folks coming from Afghanistan, I'll say that I don't think many people were prepared for this. The level of trauma is not what we usually see. Like Erika said, they usually are in a refugee camp for quite some time. Youth coming from the border kind of know the process, like I'm coming in, they'll place me in a temporary shelter, I'll be reunified with my family members once that's all settled, and I'm good to go. These children right now have no idea what's going on. They did not choose to come and be put into these big shelters without interpretation services. And so it's just been a big challenge for our team. I will say we were able to partner with the state to get dollars and with the federal government to get dollars to help do more group therapy, support groups with the Afghan population. But we've also been working because of COVID on doing more mental health outreach in various communities. Like what you said, different cultures have different approaches to mental health. Now, they might not, I don't like saying they don't understand mental health, it's just they don't use the terminology. And so we want to be as responsive culturally to different groups, to different faith traditions and how they understand their own well-being. So we are doing more like group therapy, or even just conversations of like, how do you talk about mental health? Is it you talk about the pain in your head and like bodily pain, and then how do you provide more services that focus on that?
I'll just add, one of the exciting and also frustrating things about like the Afghan operation is that a lot of resources got sunk into sort of one population and one emergency, but it put a spotlight on the work more broadly. And so we are really trying to use some like pilot type initiatives as well as advocacy opportunities around this for other populations, for everybody that's coming. So we've been working with some academic institutions across the country. We have a family strengthening initiative that's evidence-based, trying to, going to be looking at putting that in place initially with the Afghan population, but then we're in the process of like looking at funding options to Health and Human Services to expand it to other populations. So it's like I said, it's been frustrating to have to focus all of our efforts. Not frustrating because they don't need it; they absolutely need it. But we know so many others do as well. And so trying to use that as a moment to like shift some of our programming and practices to try and move the needle on some of these issues that have so long been underfunded or ignored.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
I think from a mental health standpoint, it's not just to like an organization to provide therapy. We need different stakeholders in the community to have a trauma-informed response, to understand this population and what it means to have a trauma-informed response. I know Erika works with the schools. I've worked with a lot of schools around mental health, and there's a lot of talk about trauma-informed teaching, trauma-informed classrooms, but it doesn't really consider war trauma. And so people often are in over their heads and are not required training around this. As Andy mentioned, in Grand Rapids, the officer-involved shooting, we've heard a lot from the community of need for the police departments to have a more trauma-informed approach to policing, especially when it comes to this intersection of identities that includes potentially limited English, as well as cultural differences, and then the war trauma that folks are bringing.
Is there a ceiling that you guys are looking at in terms of our capacity to take in more? So you said we're already stretched at 1,800 for this year alone. Is there a number? I heard you say you're going to go back and ask for 4.5 billion. I'm assuming that's because we're looking at a ceiling number or the next layer. What does that forecast look like?
So primarily what I said about the 1,800 stretching our capacity was a combination of things. It was because we came off an administration that completely gutted the infrastructure of our work. Also, the pace at which they came and the sort of circumstances, there was not sort of that preparatory work and, you know, opportunity. Resettlement agencies usually get a lot of notice about families arriving. And so, you know, there's just sort of a different process, pace, and coming off a very, you know, sort of different 4 years in this work. So that's part of it. As far, I think that's something that moving forward, our office in partnership with resettlement agencies want to get better about too, is like, what does that mean? Like community capacity, housing infrastructure is not ideal right now for affordable housing and an extreme challenge across the board. And we by no means want to compete with other, you know, communities of color or communities that, you know, are challenged to find affordable housing for their families. So like, you know, leveraging all of those conversations is extremely important to us. I know there's some agencies, you know, to really get at what community capacity is. That said, all of the communities that have refugee resettlement agencies in them right now are extremely welcoming communities that, you know, want to come up with solutions to continue to make it happen. To Andy's point, there is, you know, not only cultural and, you know, benefits to the communities like makeup, but there's economic benefits. Immigrants absolutely, as he said, do not steal jobs. Like, you know, they create jobs. You know, for every like one immigrant entrepreneur creates 10 to 12 jobs, you know, for American-born citizens. So, you know, it's a good question, and I don't have like the perfect answer on what our specific capacity is, but it's something that we take seriously, you know, have those conversations with local school districts, with local health departments, with the municipalities around, you know, employment opportunities and housing. So,
yeah, we're required by our contractors and the federal government to hold community consultation meetings with different stakeholders. And we have to, right now, we're actually in the process of submitting our what we're proposing that is our capacity in this coming year that has to be approved by the state. And I'll say that we are very limited to what we can do right now because we're looking at the housing situation and we're recovering from the evacuation of Afghanistan. And it's hard when a community really wants to like we get calls all the time about, oh, what are we going to do for Ukraine? And it's really hard when our systems are so stretched and we want to be welcoming, but we need more systemic change in terms of like affordable housing. Like that's not just something that we can kind of slap bang together on the ground. And so those are issues that I think we're looking at. How do we, as refugee and immigrant supporters, enter those spaces about fair housing and affordable housing and speak up about how this particular population is impacted by that.
And in terms of like the ceiling on what we're asking for with additional money, that's kind of independent of the refugee situation. I think, but would support it as well. Because again, we have a lot of international students coming to Michigan. How do we connect them with jobs here, you know, on graduation? And then those that already are here legally, you know, let's avoid that brain waste where maybe they're working in a profession that doesn't match what their credentials are, maybe from their home country. So there's a lot more we could do there. We think, again, Steve Tabachman's numbers that I bought into, I believe, is that over the next decade, we can add tens of thousands of more people to our population if we do a better job of that. In those key areas.
And I'll just add that in terms of numbers, like it's helpful to your perspective. 1,800 is a number that we've resettled recently, but typically in a given year, Michigan is one of the top states across the country in numbers resettled, which is 4,000 or 5,000. So Lansing has typically resettled about 600 people every single year, and that went down to under 100 over the last 4 years. And then COVID, so for the last 6 years, it's been really, really low. So rebuilding that infrastructure has been hard. It's just helpful to know that for 4 decades, the United States has welcomed about 80,000 refugees every single year. And that went down to about 15,000 in the last couple of years.
So let me juxtapose that with, it went down to 15,000. Your go-to response was to place responsibility on the downsizing of a current administration when we've had 2 years to respond to the global pandemic. and establish in those downtimes a roadway to be able to respond in the way that we knew it was coming because our southern border is open. So I think that that's a really unfair statement to kick the can to the last administration when the current administration isn't meeting the needs for the policies that they have in place. Further, housing is going to be an issue because what's happening right now is, at least in the community that I live in, there's a proposal for over $90 million in expenditures to increase 15,000 public housing units at low cost, but zero oversight to the communities that are paying for the taxes at the local, the state, and then the federal level. So these communications going forward make people like me very distrustful because I hear that you can't handle 1,800 people, and yet we have how many people coming through an open border at the south of our country. And I know that as a sanctuary state, many of those people will be targeted to come here to Michigan. And what I'm hearing is that you can't handle that. So that's going to be a really huge challenge to change my mind.
So a couple of clarifying points. I don't think anybody up here said we can't handle 1,800. I think we said stretch capacity given a lot of different factors. And the other component, the border, situation is sort of its own policy conversation that is not necessarily relevant to refugee resettlement work, as well as some of what Andy's trying to work on as far as those individuals that have employment authorization. And again, I would defer. There's not a federal representative here to answer questions around federal policy, but the one takeaway I want to make sure is I don't think any of us are suggesting that we couldn't handle it or that communities aren't prepared, but that one, we want to do it responsibly, and two, it's happened in a different way at a different pace under conditions that changed the staffing and the resources that previously existed when the state was consistently, operating at a level of 3,000 to 4,000 individuals.
Yeah, and just being a Chamber of Commerce guy, right, and working with Bethany and our history in Western Michigan, we got reached out to right away when the last administration took that number of refugees down really low because of the impact it would have on the system. So I think that's the message I hear is that those things definitely have impact on the overall system. To your point on housing, though, isn't it a weird time we live in when there's not enough people to work all the jobs that are available, but there's not enough housing to put everybody in? Like, man, this is weird. But just really tough, issues that we got to be tackling. And I think both these issues, immigration and the housing issues, we really got to get our arms around, and it'll be to Michigan's competitive advantage if we do both of these really well. In terms of concerns on the southern border, I would say it seems, and maybe I could defer to the doctor here at the lectern, but it seems like the majority of the American public, based upon polling I've seen, they want to see immigration laws enforced, borders enforced, but at the same time kind of sensible pathways to immigration that kind of make sense so that people can get to legal status. And I think there is, again, maybe it's my hope, my optimism on this, and maybe it's naive, but that we can get to a situation where we kind of fix both of those things at the same time.
I know we have to close here soon, so I just got a couple quick questions. Number one, first of all, thank you, I appreciate it. Is this being shared? Can I watch this at a later point in time?
You will see the video.
Yes, okay, wonderful. Number one. Number two, I just wanted to say, my name is Ciso. I'm like a first-generation American. I've got a couple complaints, you know what I mean? But I don't want to complain. I want to see what I can do in order to help make things better. So I'm available. I'm sure you can connect with me if you'd like to. I'm from Lansing. I believe in a lot of the work that is going on at the RDC. My other question was, I might not know, is there already a place where this conversation is happening, maybe in real time, where people are interacting? Because we can't engage with personally on a certain level and you're already busy doing so many things, like it's like chat room, stuff like this. And so, if not,
There you go, that's your job.
Well, all we can offer is for the interim, the speakers are with us for a few more minutes, so come right up and say hello if you have additional questions. And there are a few cookies in the back, but I think we did tell people it was only going till 1. So we have had a good extended conversation, and we appreciate you all being here. And see you next time.
I'm gonna actually.
Oh, you're not feeling